Well, we can begin our conversation, and I have to say thank you very much.
Well, thank you for asking me.
You have accepted our invitation, the invitation of Expo Laboratorio Feltrinelli Foundation, which is devoted to explore, analyze, and promote research in many areas involved by the general theme of Expo Milan 2015, Feeding the Planet, Energy for Life. But I think that for us it's very important now a brief conversation with Enrica Chiappero Martinetti, which is responsible, scientifically responsible for the area of, so to say, equity, fairness, justice, poverty, and inequalities in the space of relationship between food and persons everywhere. So I ask kindly to my colleague Enrica.
Thank you, Salvatore. I want, first of all, thank you very much indeed for such a wonderful opportunity you are offering us. I would love to take advantage of such a friendly conversation with you for sharing several research questions we are trying to address, to examine in Lab Expo, and particularly in our research strand, as just Salvatore said, focus on the social and environmental sustainability of development processes. Let me start with the Global Post-2015 Development Agenda. 10 years ago, it was September 2004, as you remember, we launched at the University of Pavia the Human Development and Capability Association. Yes. Thanks to the terrific support and the scientific contribution that you and Martin Nusma gave us as a founder presidents. The association is a global academic and intellectual community which counts now almost 800 scholars in over 70 countries. The mission was, and still is, to promote a multidisciplinary dialogue around the ideas of human development and the capability approach. To what extent you think that these ideas have been or can still be effectively incorporated in the definition of the post-2015 development agenda?
Well, I think we don't quite know what the post-2015 development agenda of the United Nations is going to be. Mm-hmm. We do know that the indicators that they were dealing with preceding 2015 would come to an end, and there's a need for replacement. But those development indicators concentrated on some easily measurable issues like schooling and so forth, and avoided some of the bigger issues like democracy, human rights, and other subtler issues of gender equity, for example, it didn't. So the Millennium Development Goals, as they were called, came out of a bigger declaration of the UN, which was the Millennium Declaration, which preceded the Millennium Development Goals. That did talk about human rights, democracy, gender inequality in all its aspects. So I think this is an occasion to go back to some of those questions. Not to slacken what is being attempted to be achieved preceding 2015 with mixed success on the measurable parts of the Human Development Goal. I say measurable, I think all these are measurable, because ultimately measurability is a matter of ranking, and if you want to reach a level of, say, gender inequality, even though there is no one number we can associate, we can see whether it's meeting those criteria or not. So I think measurability in some ways is the wrong language, but that's the language they've been using. So I would say, yes, indeed, these are very much part of the concerns that they have. I've had an opportunity of twice, actually, addressing the UN on these issues. And I have reason to believe that there are other people working for it too. what the voice of the Expo of the Feltrinelli Foundation is on that would make a difference to that. Now, 2015 isn't far away. This is May 2014. And yet, there is a certain amount of continuity of thought here. And what would be particularly good is to relate the way the human development approach, including as reflected in the Millennium Declaration, has emerged, into what has been neglected and what should be more focused issues. And some of the issues of equity would be very central to that, not just gender equity, but also between the classes and social groups.
Thank you, Martha. In your last book, An Uncertain Glory, India and Its Contradiction, that you co-authored with Jean Drèze, you reaffirm the central role of political and social participation and the importance of what you call the practice of democracy through a democratic engagement in public discussion and in the decision-making processes. Agency and participation are also key issues for Lab Expo, and the workshop on these topics will be held next week at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Pavia, with the contribution of several common friends and eminent scholars, such as Muzaffar Kizilbash and Sidi Osmani. However, the practice of democracy, which is not easy to realize at the local, national level, is even more difficult to attain and to make it effective on a global scale. Which feedback mechanisms or types of public discussion do you find the most promising in order to give voice to the most vulnerable or marginalized groups that are somehow targeted by international development cooperation and aid efforts? So what we can do in order to make this participation real and genuine and active participation?
And because that is a difficult question, because it really depends on what kind of political structure these different countries have. And the world is divided between some military dictatorships, some democracies with faults, like Thailand, going through faults like India of a different kind. And then there are one-party states of different kinds. North Korea falling very far behind in every respect, and China beating the world in many respects, and yet deficiency in some other respect. So I think there's no one prescription that you can do. In India, perhaps the most important issue, and this would apply to a number of Latin American countries too, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, and so on, that to make the public discussion come online with the real problems of deprivation, rather than falling for the easy temptation of catering to the public demand, and very often also the demands of the advertisers, which make newspapers thrive, concentrate on those things that interest them. I mean, India, for example, is a kind of contradiction, because on one side, democracy is very successful. Right now there's a huge election going on with 850 million electorate. I've just come back from India having voted there, and and it's vibrant. And yet the dialogue has been so dominated by a misleading reading of what's gone wrong that the electoral results probably would reflect that. That is, rather than pointing out that the government at the moment, which is falling now, or end now, had tended to concentrate much more in the interests of the relatively prosperous middle class rather than the poor. The dialogue has been that they have gone wrong by being fiscally irresponsible and spending too much money for the poor. And of the 200 or 300 million Indians who are relatively prosperous, they may not be like rich Italians or Americans, but they are rich in comparison with the rest of India. And they are interested in certain things, and it's very difficult to read in the paper. You will be told the fiscal irresponsibility of the present government is to start these food subsidy programs and employment subsidy. Now, together they absorb a little more than 1% of GDP. On the other hand, subsidies that goes for the rich, like cheaper diesel, cheaper electricity, those who have power connection. 30% of Indians don't have electric power connection. And fertilizer subsidy for the rich farmers, cooking gas subsidy, etc. These add to about 2.63% compared with 1% for employment and food for the relatively poor. But the newspapers emphasize the first as fiscal irresponsibility and tend to be silent on the second. So it's not so much that the Indian public is unable to tell, given the right information, but the right information is denied not because of censorship. There's no censorship of that kind. And indeed, with the Right to Information Act, anyone can get any information connected with the government by just writing to the government, and the government has to deliver it within a month. So I think it's the way the democracy is practiced. Different kind of problem in, say, Thailand, where there's a vast majority, not of all the poor, but particularly the northern poor, who are the majority. And then in Bangkok and the southern areas, there's quite a different area, and even the poor feel disenfranchised by the majority. On the other hand, majority rule is majority rule. The northern people have the democracy. So I think there's a lot of differences. And similarly, if you look at authoritarian countries, what makes China, which went through a very neglectful governance at one stage, having the biggest famine in world history, when the Great Leap Forward failed and 30 million people died. But now they're doing much better than India on education and healthcare. Yeah. Now, India was never in danger of going towards North Korea. China was. And it's good that the Chinese didn't go in that direction. But there's always an element of gamble in authoritarian state, because it depends on what 12 to 20 people decide. So India has less danger of that, less danger about human rights, public expression. Sometimes some odd groups try to target, particularly some Hindu activist group recently had been targeting scholarly work to make it come down to their rather narrow interpretation of religion. But the government doesn't really exercise much censorship otherwise. So I think we have to see what these problems are. Brazil is yet another problem, very concentrated on the rich at one stage, and then from the Cardoso regime and the Lula regime is much more concerned with the populist demand. But there is a strong resistance since the economic growth has come down, as it has in India. However, coming down, of course, in India means different from in Europe. Europe congratulates itself if it has any positive growth rate. Less, 1.5%, and the British are already crowing about great success. India, the growth rate is just below 5%, and that's regarded as dismally low. So it's really a relative term. But I think we have to, there is not going to be, Enrica, a general formula. What I am delighted about is that if there's a big research project in which you in particular is strongly involved, then we can, in terms of work that you have done and that many of us have been involved in, that we can separate out these problems, and rather than thinking of one solution for every country in the world, find out what the problems are. Yeah. And I think that's the direction we have to go. And that's also a general problem of how to articulate the post-2015 goals. Because the goals will be widely different. I mean, if you're dealing with North Korea, you try to get some element of democracy into the story. Yeah. That's not going to do anything for you for Brazil or India. There you need a completely different dialogue.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Amartya. there is still one point that I would like to raise to your attention. As we have already said, our Lab Expo research team is mainly focused on sustainability of the development processes, and particularly on issues such as the unequal access to social and environmental resources, and to socioeconomic and energy services, on the vulnerability of certain regions of the world and the exposure of risk of specific groups of population. All these issues are essentially global issues that produce global effects and require, therefore, a global governance. As you might remember, we tried to address this topic in the Cortona colloquium in 2005, and now my question is, how can we go beyond the globalization of consumption and promote a globalization of responsibilities? What kind of institutions and rule of games can contribute to share responsibilities for an equitable and sustainable development in a shared planet? So again, the problem is that it's hard to identify receipts at the national and local level. It is also much harder to identify what could be the tools and the actions that can be implemented at the global level.
I think there are three things to say. I think first that ultimately the biggest responsibility has to be with the national government. Mm-hmm. And it depends also on how the government is elected, what makes them survive and so on, what makes them responsible. That's a big question. Secondly, it's extremely important to have public dialogue globally about issues of social responsibility of human beings. You may want to make it more formal by talking about and as if global citizenship, but that doesn't add very much to it, but the responsibility of humanity in a way that Adam Smith or Marco de Condorcet or Mary Wollstonecraft discussed in the 18th century already. Now, these are very important things to pursue today, and nothing is as important as global dialogue on these subjects. The third would be to have some kind of assigned role, which sometimes you have to do, particularly when it comes to environmental control and control about sustainability. But I think it's very important also to recognize that you cannot arrive at a real formula without very extensive dialogue. What went wrong with the Copenhagen summit was because the Europeans had decided, being the most forward part, I mean, the Europeans are most backward, I believe, in the world in terms of economic planning. The austerity was a huge mistake, having a single euro without a combining fiscal policy, without even a combined bank, without a political union, was an absolutely poppycock of an idea, a really terrible idea. On the other hand, the Europeans are very responsible on sustainability. But they thought somehow they can arrive at a formula which everyone will sign. People don't sign these agreements. Chinese say rightly, look, you people have been polluting the world. The moment we start polluting, you say the rules are changed. And then the Indians sort of, they haven't polluted very much because their industrial development is far less than in China. And they're much more concerned with things like IT, which doesn't pollute that much. But they too joined the Chinese, but the Africans were not even speaking up. And then when their turn to industrialization would come, they don't want to be left at a time when Europeans and Americans and China and India and Brazil have absorbed all the global space. So I think there's a need for discussion. So the central issue is really very important. That is public dialogue as to who should do what, how that could be done, and what went wrong with Copenhagen is to arrive at an exact formula without any dialogue. That's not the way to do it. And we have known that from 18th century, but we should have by now, in two and a half centuries, learned it. Alas, we haven't. So I would say it's not so much assigned responsibility, but discussion of responsibility. And from there may be particular agreements that follow. That will be the right way. Discussion, agreement, not agreement and then discussion.
Yes,
quite
discussion and after agreement, yes.
Thank you very much, Amartya. This is really food for thought for us that will foster and drive our Lab Expo research project in the next month. Thank you very much indeed, Amartya.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amartya, very much.
Thank you, Salvatore.
Okay.